June 1942. In the shadowed halls of the Reich Chancellery, maps are spread across polished tables, the red arrows stabbing east toward a single name, and in block letters, Stalingrad. At the center of this plan stands Generaloberst Friedrich Paulus, a meticulous staff officer elevated by Adolf Hitler into the Nazi inner circle. Paulus is not a charismatic field commander. He is precise, obedient, shaped by doctrine and loyalty. Now, he is handed command of the German Sixth Army, the largest force Germany has ever assembled for a single objective. The campaign is called Fall Blau Case Blue. Its aim is oil, industry, and prestige. Hitler believes that taking Stalingrad will shatter Soviet morale and secure the southern flank. Paulus listens as Hitler speaks, noting orders without protest. Around him, men like Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl nod in silence. This is power without debate, obedience enforced by fear. Paulus understands the message clearly. Failure is not an option. Retreat is unthinkable. By July, the Sixth Army moves across the southern Russian steppe. Columns of infantry march under a burning sun. Panzer divisions grind forward through dust and heat. Engines strained, supply lines already stretched thin. Paulus advances exactly as ordered. The Luftwaffe pounds Soviet positions ahead of him, flattening villages, turning roads into graveyards of shattered wood and scorched earth. Resistance is uneven, but growing. The Red Army retreats, but not in panic. They trade space for time. Paulus receives reports daily fuel shortages, exhausted men, vehicles breaking down. He forwards them upward. The replies are always the same: advance. The inner circle demands results. Paulus obeys. He believes discipline and organization will compensate for uncertainty. By late August, the Volga River appears on the horizon. Smoke rises endlessly. Stalingrad burns before the Germans even enter it. On August 23, 1942, the Luftwaffe launches a massive bombing raid. Tens of thousands of civilians are killed. The city is transformed into ruins, jagged concrete, twisted steel, fires that refuse to die. Paulus watches from his command post as reports describe total devastation. He believes, briefly, that the city cannot possibly be defended in this state. But the ruins become weapons. As Sixth Army units push into the outskirts, Soviet resistance hardens. Every factory, every cellar, every staircase becomes a battlefield. Orders from Berlin grow more demanding. Hitler wants the city taken quickly, cleanly, as proof of dominance. Paulus knows the truth already. This is no longer a maneuver war. It is a grinding fight of attrition, and the Sixth Army is being pulled deeper into it. By September, Paulus's headquarters is flooded with casualty figures. Divisions bleed strength by the hour. Still, the orders do not change. Hold the line. Take the city. Do not retreat. Paulus stands over the map again. Red arrows, now tangled and uncertain, as the sound of. That sound does not fade. It grows closer. By early September 1942, the Sixth Army is fully committed inside Stalingrad. Its formations fractured into regiments fighting for individual streets. Paulus remains miles behind the front, issuing orders through telephones that rarely stay silent for long. Reports arrive by the hour: ammunition shortages, battalions reduced to companies, officers killed leading assaults through smoke-choked corridors. Still, Paulus repeats the directive he has received from above: press forward. There will be no withdrawal, not even to regroup. The Germans name their objective points as if labels can impose control. The Red October Factory, the Tractor Factory, the Barricade. In reality, each becomes a killing ground. Soviet defenders, under General Vasily Chukov's 62nd Army, cling to the west bank of the Volga. Reinforcements cross the river at night in small boats, under artillery fire, knowing survival chances are slim. Paulus underestimates this resolve. His planning assumes the enemy is nearly broken. The casualty figures tell a different story. Hitler's messages become more personal, more intrusive. Paulus is ordered to seize the city center, then the riverbank itself. Air reconnaissance claims victory is close. Paulus wants to believe it. He commits his last fresh divisions, pushing them into rubble where tanks cannot maneuver and artillery cannot be massed. German infantry advance room by room, bayonets fixed, flamethrowers brought forward. The Soviets counterattack immediately, emerging from cellars and sewer tunnels. The front line shifts by meters, sometimes by stairwells. By October, winter announces itself early. Rain turns to sleet. Supply trucks bog down on roads already shattered by bombing. Paulus requests permission to shorten his lines, to pull back exhausted units. The reply from the Führer headquarters is blunt. Stalingrad must be held at all costs. Paulus signs the order and sends it forward. Obedience is automatic now, stripped of illusion. Within the Nazi inner circle, blame begins to circulate quietly. Hermann Göring assures Hitler that the Luftwaffe can supply the army if needed. Paulus hears the secondhand and says nothing. He knows the numbers. He knows the airfields are inadequate, the distances too great. But he does not challenge the promise. The structure he serves does not reward doubt. In November, Soviet artillery falls silent and absence Paulus notices immediately. Reconnaissance reports unusual troop movements north and south of the city. Paulus forwards the information. He is told the enemy is incapable of major action. He accepts the assessment. His focus remains fixed on the ruins in front of him. On November 19, 1942, the silence breaks. A thunderous barrage erupts against the Romanian armies guarding 6th Army's flanks. Paulus receives fragmented reports, positions overrun, communications lost, armored formations appearing where none were expected. Within hours, the realization settles slowly, then all at once. By November 22, 1942, Soviet armored spearheads from the north and south meet near Kalach, cutting the last road west. 6th Army is surrounded. Nearly 300,000 men are sealed inside what will soon be called the Kessel, the Cauldron. Paulus sends an immediate signal to Army Group B, requesting authorization to break out while fuel and cohesion still exist. The response does not come from them. It comes from Hitler himself. 6th Army will hold its positions. Stalingrad will be a fortress. The order is absolute. Paulus reads it in silence. He understands what it means. A breakout now might save a fraction of his force, but it would require disobedience. Paulus does not consider it. His entire career has been built on compliance. He issues the directive to hold, reorganizing his trapped divisions into defensive sectors as Soviet artillery tightens the ring. Göring's promise becomes policy. The Luftwaffe is ordered to supply the encircled army by air. Paulus calculates the requirement over 700 tons per day and compares it to reality. In good weather, under perfect conditions, the transports might deliver a quarter of that. Winter weather grounds aircraft. Soviet fighters hunt them relentlessly. Each lost Ju-52 is irreplaceable. The math is unforgiving. By December, starvation begins. Horses are slaughtered. Ammunition is rationed. Wounded men freeze to death in field hospitals without fuel. Paulus continues to send situation reports. Carefully worded, precise, restrained. He does not dramatize. He does not plead. The replies from the Führer headquarters are increasingly detached from reality, filled with slogans about endurance and sacrifice. Outside the pocket, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launches Operation Winterstorm, a relief attempt from the south. Paulus is informed of the advance. He waits for authorization to break out and link up. It never arrives. Hitler forbids any movement that might abandon Stalingrad. Manstein's panzers reach within 50 kilometers. Paulus listens to distant artillery and does nothing. Fuel stocks are held back for a defense that has no strategic value left. Inside the city, Soviet forces tighten their grip. They reduce the pocket systematically, sector by sector. Paulus relocates his headquarters into the basement of the Univermag department store. The temperature drops below 20 C. Men wrap rags around their boots. Frostbite cripples entire units. Discipline erodes, not through cowardice, but through exhaustion beyond human limits. In January 1943, Hitler promotes Paulus to Generalfeldmarschall. The message is unmistakable. No German field marshal has ever surrendered. Paulus receives the news without comment. He understands the expectation. He also understands the reality on the ground. No food, no ammunition, no relief. No escape. Soviet loudspeakers begin broadcasting surrender offers. Paulus forbids his men from listening. The fighting continues, hollow, and the destruction accelerates. By mid-January 1943, the Soviet command initiates Operation Ring, the final reduction of the encircled Sixth Army. Artillery fires without pause. Heavy guns position methodically around the pocket. Each barrage is calculated, not to shock, but to erase resistance section by section. Paulus listens from underground as the concussions shake. Dust from the ceiling above his map table. Telephone lines fail. Runners replace wires, many never returning. The German pocket splits under pressure. On 10 January, Soviet forces shatter the Western defenses. Within days, the Sixth Army is cut into a northern and southern group. Paulus remains in the southern pocket, his headquarters buried beneath the ruins of Stalingrad. He issues orders that no longer move formations, only remnants companies reduced to squads to handfuls of men holding cellars and stairwells. Food supplies collapse entirely. Bread rations vanish. Men boil wallpaper paste and leather. Ammunition is counted by the cartridge. Paulus records these facts in his daily report, knowing the transmission may never reach Berlin. When it does, the response contains no authorization to surrender, only exhortations to fight on, to uphold the honor of the German army. Inside the Nazi inner circle, responsibility dissolves upward into ideology. Hitler insists the Sixth Army's sacrifice is buying time. Paulus sees no evidence of this. He sees only collapse. Yet he does not disobey. He orders continued resistance, sector by sector, as Soviet infantry advance behind rolling barrages, supported by tanks grinding over frozen debris. On 26 January, Soviet spearheads link up near the tractor factory, fully dividing the German forces. Paulus is now isolated from General Karl Strecker's northern group. Communication ceases. The Sixth Army no longer exists as a unified command. Paulus understands that effective control has ended. What remains is symbolic resistance. Soviet officers send parliamentary envoys under white flags. Paulus refuses to meet them. He believes correctly that surrender must come from higher authority, or not at all. His staff grows silent. Maps are no longer updated. The front line is too close, too fluid, too broken to track. On January 30, 1943, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, a radio message arrives. Paulus is ordered to fight to the last man. He is reminded of his rank. He is reminded of history. The implication is clear. Death is preferable to capture. Paulus reads the order, folds it carefully, and places it on the table. That night, Soviet troops break into the city center. Gunfire echoes through the basement corridors. Explosions collapse stairwells above. Paulus's aides prepare to destroy documents. Pistols are laid out, quietly, without discussion. Paulus does not take one. As dawn approaches, the sound of Soviet boots grows louder overhead. Paulus sits at the table, uniform unbuttoned, eyes fixed on a map that no longer. The end arrives without ceremony. On the morning of January 31, 1943, Soviet troops of the 64th Army push through the final German positions surrounding the Univermag department store. Resistance is sporadic, now isolated bursts of rifle fire, then silence. Paulus's headquarters is already half buried under rubble. When Soviet officers descend into the basement, they find a man who no longer commands an army, only the remnants of an order long obeyed. Paulus identifies himself calmly. He does not resist. He does not salute. For the first time since taking command, he issues an order not to fight. The southern pocket of the Sixth Army ceases organized resistance. In the north, General Strecker continues fighting, unaware of Paulus's decision, or unwilling to accept it. The battle is not yet fully over. Paulus is taken into Soviet custody. His capture is a psychological shock in Berlin. Hitler receives the news with rage. A field marshal has surrendered, something no one in the Nazi inner circle believed possible. The myth of absolute loyalty fractures in that moment. But inside Stalingrad, the consequences are immediate and brutal. German units lay down their weapons by the thousands. Too weak to continue, Too numb to celebrate survival, on February 2, 1943, Strecker surrenders the northern group. The Battle of Stalingrad ends. Of the original force, fewer than 100,000 men march into captivity. Many will not survive the coming months. Paulus is transported east, questioned, isolated. He remains silent, speaking only when required, still bound by habit and discipline. As the ruins are cleared, Soviet soldiers document what remains: frozen corpses, shattered equipment, abandoned guns. Stalingrad becomes more than a victory. It becomes proof that the German army can be destroyed completely, not merely pushed back. The strategic balance of the war shifts permanently. For Paulus, the war continues in confinement. In captivity, he is confronted with the decisions he did not make, the orders he did not challenge, the authority he did not defy. The Soviet Union will later use him as a voice against the regime he once served. But that moment is still ahead. For now, Paulus sits in a guarded room, removed from command, from ideology, from the inner circle that elevated him and then abandoned him. The silence is total. Outside, the war moves on without him. And as the snows melt over Stalingrad, the question remains unanswered whether obedience, when taken to its absolute limit, becomes indistinguishable from betrayal. Captivity strips away illusion. In February 1943, Paulus is moved deeper into the Soviet interior, away from the ruins that sealed his fate. The journey east is slow, guarded, deliberate. He travels not as a prize, but as evidence. For the first time since the war began, a senior member of Hitler's inner military circle is alive, defeated, and available to speak. Paulus understands this immediately. He says nothing. Interrogations begin quietly. Soviet officers ask about command structures, about Hitler's decision-making, about the culture of obedience that bound the German army to a single will. Paulus answers with caution. He describes procedures, not motives. He frames collapse as logistical failure, not ideological obsession. The habit of careful phrasing remains intact. Even now, he avoids direct condemnation. Back in Germany, Stalingrad is officially described as a heroic sacrifice. The truth is buried beneath propaganda. Paulus's name is spoken only with bitterness. He is declared dead to the regime. His family is placed under surveillance. Loyalty, once demanded absolutely, is now retroactively denied. In captivity, Paulus begins to see documents, captured orders, intercepted communications, evidence of crimes committed behind the lines. The scale is undeniable. The war he served is revealed not as necessity, but as design. This exposure is gradual, relentless. Paulus listens, he reads, he does not yet respond. By 1944, the war has turned decisively against Germany. Soviet victories roll westward. Paulus is relocated again, placed among other captured officers. Conversations change tone. For the first time, Paulus speaks openly not to the Soviets, but to fellow Germans. He questions the logic of sacrifice without purpose. He questions the authority that forbade retreat, that demanded annihilation over maneuver. The man who never disobeyed now begins to analyze why he never did. The Soviets offer him a role in the National Committee for a Free Germany. It is not framed as betrayal, but as responsibility. Paulus hesitates. Acceptance would mean publicly condemning Hitler. Refusal would mean silence forever. He considers Stalingrad, the men frozen in cellars, the orders he transmitted unchanged. The moment he realized escape was possible, and did nothing. When Paulus finally agrees to speak, it is not out of ideology, it is out of reckoning. His recorded statements are calm, precise, devastating. He describes the Führer's interference, the refusal to authorize withdrawal, the illusion of air supply. The voice of obedience becomes the voice of indictment. Yet even now, Paulus is not free. He speaks under guard, in controlled settings, his words weaponized by a new power. He understands this too. History has placed him between regimes, used by both, absolved by neither. As the Red Army approaches Berlin, Paulus listens to reports of the Reich collapsing. The inner circle that once dictated his every move disintegrates under its own weight. Power, waiting becomes its own battlefield. By early 1945, Paulus is no longer interrogated as a source of intelligence, but preserved as a symbol. The war he once served is collapsing in real time. Reports reach him daily: cities lost, armies destroyed, fronts dissolving faster than orders can be written. The structure that demanded absolute obedience from him now disintegrates without ceremony. In February, Paulus is brought before Soviet officials again. This time, the request is direct. He is asked to address German soldiers still fighting, to urge surrender, to explain that Stalingrad was not an isolated tragedy, but a warning ignored. Paulus understands the weight of this moment. His voice once transmitted orders that sent men into annihilation. Now, it may persuade some to live. When he speaks, he does not shout. He does not accuse. He describes facts: encirclement, starvation, the refusal of retreat, the illusion of rescue. He names Hitler directly, something he never did while in uniform. The words are careful, restrained, unmistakable. This is not defiance born of courage, but of delayed clarity. Inside Germany, the regime reacts with fury. Paulus is denounced as a traitor. His family is arrested under Sippenhaft, collective punishment for perceived betrayal. Paulus learns this weeks later. The news strikes harder than any interrogation. He remains outwardly composed, but the cost of speaking is now undeniable. Loyalty, even after silence, offers no protection. As Soviet forces close on Berlin, Paulus is flown to the outskirts of the city. He does not enter the capital. Instead, he listens as artillery pounds it into ruins. He hears reports of Hitler's final days: paranoia, isolation, orders issued to units that no longer exist. The inner circle has become a vacuum, consuming itself. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler is dead. The man who elevated Paulus, constrained him, and destroyed his army, has taken his own life. There is no satisfaction in the news, only confirmation. Paulus does not celebrate. He does not speak. The war ends days later. In the aftermath, Paulus is summoned as a witness. His testimony is not theatrical. He explains how decisions were made, how dissent was suppressed, how obedience was enforced through fear and career survival. He does not excuse himself. He does not dramatize. He presents the machinery as it functioned and himself as a component within it. As Europe begins to rebuild, Paulus remains in Soviet custody. Freedom is postponed indefinitely. The Battle of Stalingrad is now history, studied, debated, mythologized. But for Paulus, it is unfinished. It lives in unanswered questions, in choices deferred until choice itself was gone. And as the world moves forward, Paulus remains suspended between past and consequence, knowing that survival did not absolve him and that surrender, when it finally came, arrived far too late. The war is over, but captivity does not end with peace. In 1946, while Europe rebuilds in fragments, Friedrich Paulus remains in the Soviet Union, confined not by bars but by relevance. He is no longer a general in command, nor a defeated enemy awaiting trial. He is something more ambiguous, useful, watched, unresolved. His presence itself is political. Paulus is summoned to Nuremberg as a witness. He enters the courtroom not as an accused, but as a former insider. The men seated in the dock Keitel, Jodl, Gring once issued orders he obeyed without question. Now, they listen as Paulus describes the machinery of command, the centralization of authority, the consequences of dissent. He speaks with restraint. He names facts, dates, directives. He does not raise his voice. The courtroom does not need it. When asked about Stalingrad, Paulus explains the refusal to authorize withdrawal, the insistence on holding symbolic ground, the fantasy of air supply. His testimony strips away mythology. What remains is administrative failure enforced by ideology. The inner circle, once untouchable, is exposed as operationally reckless and morally bankrupt. After Nuremberg, Paulus returns to confinement. Years pass. He reads extensively military history, philosophy, accounts of the war written by others. Stalingrad appears again and again, each retelling shaping him into either villain or victim. He recognizes elements of both, and rejects absolution from either side. In 1953, after Stalin's death, Paulus's status changes. He is transferred to East Germany, not as a prisoner, but not as a free man either. The state presents him as an example of former field marshal who broke with Hitler. Paulus accepts a civilian role, advising on military history, speaking cautiously about responsibility and command. His words are measured. He refuses simplifications. The battle he fought never leaves him. He dreams of maps without exits, of orders that cannot be amended. He understands now that power is not only exercised through command, but through silence. The failure to speak, when speech might have altered outcome, becomes its own form of action. Paulus lives quietly, avoiding spectacle. He does not seek redemption. He does not deny guilt. He studies how institutions collapse when loyalty replaces judgment. Stalingrad remains the axis around which everything turns. A campaign that reveals how fear travels downward and obedience travels upward, until both meet in catastrophe. As the Cold War hardens Europe into opposing camps, Paulus exists between them, claimed by neither, fully trusted by neither. His life after surrender is longer than his time at war, but it is defined entirely by the moment. He chose not to choose, and as years accumulate, the question sharpens rather than fades. Whether a soldier's duty ends with obedience or begins where obedience must be refused. Time narrows rather than softens memory. By the late 1950s, Friedrich Paulus is an aging man in a divided Germany, his name permanently bound to one city and one decision. The Soviet Union no longer needs his voice as urgently. The East German state keeps him visible but controlled lectures, interviews, carefully framed appearances. He understands the boundaries and stays within them. Discipline, once military, has become personal survival. Paulus revisits Stalingrad endlessly, not in public speeches, but in private analysis. He redraws the campaign in his mind, the extended flanks, the reliance on allied armies, the refusal to authorize withdrawal, the fantasy that willpower could replace fuel and food. He accepts his role without evasion. He commanded. He transmitted orders. He did not break ranks when breaking ranks might have saved lives. This conclusion is inescapable. Western historians debate him from a distance. Some describe him as weak, others as trapped. Paulus rejects both. Weakness implies inability. Trapped implies inevitability. He knows there was a moment brief, dangerous, uncertain when disobedience was possible. He did not take it. That fact alone defines him more than rank or captivity ever did. As Cold War tensions harden, Stalingrad becomes a symbol claimed by ideologies Paulus no longer serves. To the east, it is proof of socialist endurance. To the west, proof of Nazi overreach. To Paulus, it remains a battlefield where command divorced itself from reality, and fear replaced judgment at every level. He sees how systems reward obedience until obedience becomes catastrophic. In 1960, Paulus publishes Reflections on Military Leadership, stripped of slogans, focused on accountability. He does not glorify resistance, nor does he excuse submission. He frames command as a moral burden, not merely a technical function. The work receives little attention outside academic circles, but for Paulus, it is a final report written not for superiors, but for history. His health declines. The man who survived encirclement and starvation now weakens quietly. There are no ceremonies, no reconciliations with former comrades. Many are dead. Others refuse contact. Paulus does not seek it. He understands that forgiveness cannot be requested, only granted or withheld. In February 1962, Paulus knows the end is near. He reviews his life not as a sequence of promotions, but as a narrowing corridor of choices. Stalingrad stands at the center of it, immutable. He accepts that legacy cannot be reshaped after the fact. As he looks back, the lesson is stark and unresolved, that power demands obedience, but history judges restraint. That fear enforces silence, but silence enables disaster. And that betrayal does not always come from defiance, but sometimes from following orders too well. And with that understanding, Paulus fades from the public record, leaving behind a single unanswered question that outlives him: whether the greatest failure of command is The end comes quietly. On February 1, 1962, Friedrich Paulus dies in Dresden, far from the Volga, far from the ruins that defined him. There are no military honors, no state funeral. The man who once commanded an army disappears with little ceremony. His passing noted briefly, his name already fixed in history by a single winter 2 decades earlier. Yet Stalingrad does not end with his death. It continues in doctrine, in classrooms. In the warnings, commanders choose either to heed or to ignore. Paulus's legacy is not tactical brilliance or battlefield failure alone. It is the anatomy of obedience inside a system where dissent is treated as treason, and loyalty is measured by how completely judgment is surrendered. He was not a fanatic. He was not reckless. He did not seek annihilation, and that is precisely why his story endures. Paulus represents the professional officer absorbed into an inner circle where power flows downward as commands, and fear flows upward as silence. At Stalingrad, every warning sign appeared in time: exposed flanks, exhausted troops, impossible supply calculations. None were acted upon decisively, not because they were unknown, but because acting on them required defiance. The Sixth Army dies not in a single moment, but in stages: first flexibility, then initiative, then choice. By the time surrender becomes inevitable is already meaningless. The catastrophe is complete long before the final order is given. Paulus understands this too late, and carries it for the rest of his life. In the years after his death, historians argue over him. Some condemn, some contextualize. Few resolve the contradiction. Paulus is both responsible and constrained, both decision-maker and instrument. His failure is not unique to Stalingrad. It is repeated wherever authority is absolute and accountability dissolves into hierarchy. The Nazi inner circle he once served collapses spectacularly, consumed by the very rigidity it demanded. Power enforced through fear proves incapable of adaptation. Betrayal comes not from rebellion, but from obedience carried to its logical extreme. Stalingrad becomes the turning point of the war, but also a permanent lesson in command. Not about courage or sacrifice, but about responsibility. About the moment when a leader must choose between orders and reality, between career and conscience, between survival and symbolism. Paulus never publicly claims redemption. He leaves no final declaration. Instead, his life ends as it was lived: measured, restrained, unresolved. The question he leaves behind remains deliberately unanswered. When is a soldier no longer bound to obey? Because somewhere between power, fear, and betrayal, Stalingrad still waits for the next man who decides not to decide.